Well, hello. Welcome to an afternoon edition of Philosophy Lecture. Here I have my nice double shot of espresso that I've just made for myself. Just had a long day of teaching in the morning, doing work to prep for class, writing this lecture, working on a paper, and now with my double shot of espresso, I'm ready to talk about Republic Book 4. And today, we will finally find out what Socrates thinks justice is. So, I'll take a sip of espresso to that, and let's dive in. First, let me point out that today's lecture is going to have a little bit of a different format. As you can see, my face is totally covering the screen. I'm not going to do that for the entire time. But I'm not going to use a PowerPoint today. I thought I would try out giving this presentation much like I would do in my face-to-face classroom, where I would come into the classroom with a stack of handouts and I would dole them out to you, and we would work through the handout together, and I would read a little bit of it, talk through it, things like that. So that's what we're going to do today. So if you haven't gone to the website to download the two associated handouts for today's lecture, go ahead and do that. They're both titled number 8. One is Lecture 8 on Plato's Republic, Book 4. The other is Lecture 8, and it's a table that sort of, in a table fashion, presents the analysis of the virtues in Book 4. So go ahead and go there, download that. Now I'm going to downsize my face a little bit. There we go. Now I'm in appropriate size. And we're going to open up today's two associated handouts. Okay, so this is what they'll look like, right? One is the table that presents the analysis of the virtues in Republic Book 4. And the other is this nice PDF document that is basically the outline of the lecture that I'm going to give today. So I'm going to leave this up here on the screen. You should have it either printed out or available on your screen, and you can annotate this document as we work our way through it. Okay? All right. So what we've done up to this point in the Republic is we have, in the beginning of Book 2, been presented with Glaucon's challenge to Socrates, for Socrates to show him what is intrinsically good about justice, so that he can, in some way, address Thrasymachus's unsettling view of justice that he presented in Republic Book 1. So the way Glaucon does this, as you may recall, is he presents Thrasymachus's view of justice in a way that is clearer and more forceful than how Thrasymachus himself did it in Republic Book 1. So he presents a three-stage argument for this claim. The first stage of it is an origin story about, justice and what this shows us about the essence of justice. So we get a story about the origin and the essence of justice in this. The second stage is a argument based on the first stage, that justice is merely an extrinsic good, thereby justifying the claim that popular opinion has about justice, namely that justice is merely an extrinsic good. It's something that we value only for what it produces, not for what it is in and of itself. In and of itself, we find justice burdensome, but the product of justice, namely not having to suffer injustice, is something that we value. Finally, the argument is given that really the best form of life possible for a human being is one that totally does away with justice in all parts of your life, and instead practices injustice in such a way that you're never caught, so that you do injustice and get all the benefits of doing injustice, while at the same time fooling everyone around you into thinking that you are in fact just when you are not. Okay, so that's the setup. How does Socrates respond to this? Well, that's what we talked about in the second lecture in our series of talks on the Republic. Socrates formulates an alternative origin story of justice. And as you may recall, the way that he begins this origin story is by thinking about the origin of the city. What is it that draws us together as human beings such that we create cities? Well, Socrates observes, it's the fact that none of us is self-sufficient. None of us can provide everything we need for ourselves on our own. So, what do? We put ourselves together into cities and we cooperate in some way to help provide for those needs that we can't provide for ourselves individually. So, what this indicates, and what I've been emphasizing in the last two lectures, right, is that this indicates that Socrates believes that the human virtues are supposed to be articulated or more properly understood in the context of a kind of cooperative activity, right? So he starts to think about the city as a thing that has a specific function, right, namely to provide for the needs of the citizens. And he thinks of it as something that we can organize in such a way that it performs this function well. In other words, he's thinking of it as something that we can imagine performing its function well, and in so doing, we can imagine its virtues. Okay? So in Republic Book 2 and Republic Books 3, he gets into some detail about some of the key virtues of the city. Right? How must we organize the city? What kinds of laws must the city have if it is in fact to perform its function well? How should we train various parts of the city? How should we train various classes in the city such that they will perform their function well? For example, the guardians. How are we going to educate them and how are we going to train them such that they can perform their function well? This has been the focus of much of Republic Books 2 and 3. Now finally, about a quarter of the way through Republic Book 4, Socrates declares the job is done, right? He puts up the mission accomplished banner, right? Which, for those of you that know the history of recent America, is always a bad sign, right? So, but in any case, right now, he thinks that they've done most of the work that they need to do in order to understand what justice is. So he then begins to articulate the different virtues that he sees present in the city, one of which is justice. Okay, so he starts to describe the intrinsic structure of the city, in particular the ways in which the different parts of the city, the different people in the city are organized, such that they can provide for each other's needs in the optimal way that he thinks the utopia does. Okay, sounds great, right? Well, before we can dive into that, we need to get a little bit more information about the utopia that Socrates has developed. The reason we need to do this is because there's some information in Republic Book 3, which we didn't read, that's really crucial, I think, for understanding key parts of what's going on in this dialogue. Right? There are certain objections that you will inevitably have if you think this through that information from Republic Book 3 will help assuage. Also, there's information from later books in the Republic, in particular Republic Book 5, that will also help answer some of these questions. So I'm going to draw on some of this stuff in this first part of today's lecture. So if you look at your handout, the first part of the handout is titled The Structure of the Utopia. And so the key idea about the utopia is basically this. Its class structure is such that it has three key classes. So there are three groups of people that are distinguished from each other in the context of the city. Okay, so these three classes are distinguished in terms of their function. They're distinguished, in other words, in terms of what they do. That's importantly different from the way that we distinguish our classes in our culture today. Right, today we rely largely on economic status, on our income status to distinguish our classes. Right, so we have upper class, middle class, and lower class, and these three classes are distinguished almost strictly in terms of our economic well-being, right? The upper class, or the so-called 1%, right? They make a whole lot of money. They have a whole lot of privileges associated with making a whole lot of money. Middle class don't make as much money, as certain privileges associated with that, certain detriments associated with that. And then lower class makes very little money, has very little privilege associated with it, so on and so forth, right? So that's the common understanding of the class structure in our culture today. That is not, let me repeat, not the way Socrates thinks about the class structure of the city in his Utopia. Rather, people are assigned to a class strictly on the basis of their function, right? So it's sort of like your nature, the way that you come out of your mother's womb with the various natural gifts and tendencies that you're given, that plays a large role in your function in the city, right? It's sort of like your nature, your natural gifts, combined with the needs that are present in the city. Those two together determine which class in the city you're going to belong to. Okay, so the three classes are as follows. There's the rulers, the auxiliaries, and the working classes. That's what we have represented here on the handout, right? Highlighting it there in blue. So one important thing to notice is that the rulers and the auxiliaries, these are both what in Republic Book 2 Plato was referring to as the guardians. What happens in Republic Book 3 is that there's a certain subset of the guardians that distinguish themselves by virtue of their excellence as guardians, by virtue of their wisdom, and also by virtue of their love for the city, that are such that they qualify as rulers. They become sort of like the leaders of the guardians of the city, and as the leader of the guardians of the city, they also become the leaders of the city as a whole. Okay, so each of these classes has different functions. There's different things that each of them does, and they do it because these are the things they can do better than anyone else in the city. So the rulers, what's their function? Well, their function is basically to make laws in the city and to give commands in the battlefield outside the city. What do the auxiliaries do? Well, the function of the auxiliaries is basically as to be helpers to the rulers, to be the ones who enforce the laws that are present within the city, and sorry, see, I already had to yawn. Have to get a little bit of espresso. Oh, that's better. Where was I? Auxiliaries, that's right. So what do the auxiliaries do? They're the helpers to the rulers. They enforce the laws in the city and they follow orders in battle, in the battlefield, right? The working classes, on the other hand, they have a function that is sort of independent of the rulers and the auxiliaries. Their function is to produce goods. If we took all the working classes as a whole, lumped them together, and tried to describe what each of them does in one common phrase, it would be this: they produce goods. But one important thing to know about the working classes is that the working classes is a class of classes, right? So within the working classes, there are a lot of different subclasses, right? You will have, and they will be distinguished from each other depending upon what it is that they produce. So examples of working class folk would be like the five that we encountered in Republic Book 2 when Socrates made his first stab at producing the ideal city. He distinguished the builders, the people who produce shelter, the farmers, the people that produce food, the cobblers, the people that produce shoes, the tailors, the people that produce clothes, and we'll also have other different crafts that produce other kinds of goods. Included in these crafts will be, people like myself, right? People who produce, who are educators, that produce educated citizens, perhaps in very general sorts of ways, like maybe mathematics, music, poetry, and maybe even physical training, right? Like what Plato talked about in Republic Book 2. Included in the working classes will also be our merchants, the people that go and sell goods and services outside the city, mostly. They'll be like traders that go out and trade for other goods that we need. Within the city, Plato seems to suggest that goods will be dispersed according to need and according to other strict rules, right? Where these rules will prevent the working classes from getting either too poor and suffering poverty or too rich and suffering from an overabundance of wealth, right? We want our workers to be good workers, and either of these extremes will ruin them as workers. Okay. So that's sort of the basic idea of the structure of the three classes of the city. But we would do well now to think about some other important bits of information about these three classes in the city, because there's a lot that we still need to know, right? So let's work through these points. The first, of course, I've already talked about how the rulers and auxiliaries are subclasses of the guardian class. Another key point here is that the rulers in the structure of the city are the most powerful class in the city. They wield the most political power. I mean, really, the word of the rulers is really the final word for what goes in the city. So it seems to be the case that the rulers aren't just going to make decisions haphazardly. The rulers, according to the analysis that Plato is giving in Republic Book 4, will make decisions that derive from a genuine capacity of wisdom. So they're going to make informed decisions. And that means that they're going to make decisions based upon, I think, a certain kind of knowledge, a general knowledge about the workings of the city. So we might think about this in terms of, what kind of supply chains must be maintained in order for the woodworkers, the builders, the farmers, the cobblers, all to be able to do their jobs and to distribute their goods efficiently and evenly throughout the city. The rulers will be thinking about these kinds of logistical things. I don't think it's very plausible to believe that the rulers will be dictating each and everything that every citizen does with every waking moment of their life. Because Socrates does talk in Republic Book 4, you may notice, if you look at the passages where he talks about wisdom, for instance, he says that there is a kind of wisdom that woodworkers have, which is a wisdom pertaining to making things out of wood. And that wisdom will belong to the woodworkers and not to the rulers. So it does seem as if the rulers will trust the woodworkers with quite a bit of what they do within their own craft, because they're the ones with that set of expertise. Okay, but it's still the case that the rulers have the most political power. Now you might be like, oh yeah, I know how this goes, right? Those in Washington, D.C., they have the greatest amount of political power, and they also have a whole lot of material wealth to boot. They're pampered, right? Well, hold on a minute. In Plato's ideal republic, in the Utopia, the class in the city with the greatest amount of material wealth are the working classes. Pretty surprising, right? But he does say that these classes will be prevented from either being subject to poverty or to having great wealth, since both of these corrupt the workers. The rulers and the auxiliaries, on the other hand, these will be, materially speaking, the poorest classes in the city. The rulers and the auxiliaries, Plato says at the end of Republic Book 3, which is a portion of the text that I actually included in the edited version of the Republic I've given to you in case you want to look at it. The rulers and the auxiliaries, he says, are forbidden by law from touching gold or silver. They're forbidden to drink wine or eat fine food. They can't do that at all. The rulers and the auxiliaries will have no private possessions, and except for basic articles of clothing and shoes that, basically only one person can use. And they will also live in tents and eat basic meats and grains, exactly like they would as if they were living on the battlefield. And they'll be stationed on the outskirts of the city, presumably in order to protect the city from outside intruders. So the form of life that the guardians will lead, that the rulers and the auxiliaries will lead, is a pretty rugged form of life and a pretty minimalistic form of life, right? So where they will have no private food, clothing, weaponry, or shelter, right? What they will have instead is a high amount of power. Okay, so it's sort of like a trade-off. They give up material wealth and comforts in order to have a great amount of power. And Plato's also convinced that this balance, where if you combine material wealth and power, you're inevitably going to be corrupt, whereas if you have great amounts of power but little amounts of material wealth, and instead of loving material things, you love things like honor and the truth or knowledge, um, then this is a better combination for having a ruling class that isn't easily corrupted. Okay. Um, Another thing to note that is also a prevention of corruption of the powerful in this city is that you have to keep in mind that since everyone in the city does one and only one job, this means that the rulers will not provide for their own food, clothing, weaponry, or shelters. Instead, they will be thoroughly dependent upon the working classes for these provisions. Okay? So there's a certain incentive on the part of the rulers to make sure that the working classes are well taken care of. That way, the rulers in turn will reap the benefits of healthy working class people, right? Namely, in the form of the goods that they provide to them. Now, as I was saying, the real reward for being a guardian is to have the honor of the city as a whole. This is something that he says at the beginning of Republic Book 4. And he also suggests that the rulers will be those who love honor in the most pure way out of all of the guardians, right? They'll be sort of like the best of the best, the cream of the crop, right? Um, We'll read in Republic Book 4, or sorry, Republic Book 7 when we get there, a little bit more about the details of the training regimen for a ruler. Okay, so the other key point here concerns the production of children. He says something about this briefly at the end of Republic Book 3, and this is really the only place where Plato mentions women at all, women and children at all, in the first 4 books of the Republic, which is pretty surprising. And this is something you might have seen already if you're reading ahead. This is something that Glaucon and Adeimantus call him out on at the beginning of Republic Book 5. They see it as a huge gap in Plato's account of the city, right? Well, what are you going to do with women and children? How are you going to actually produce children, right? Well, what Socrates says at the end of Republic Book 3 is that the guardians will closely oversee the production of children, and that they'll probably produce children in the course of a kind of religious ceremony that will be held every few years, right? Where certain couples will be chosen by the gods to be married, and in this union of wedlock to have children. But of course, since being a parent is a job, the children won't be raised by their biological parents. Rather, the children will be raised when they're young by a designated class in the city, right? Maybe the maids and the wet nurses that will feed the children, right, and raise them. And then they will be, after the kids grow up a little bit, they'll be passed on to the teachers. And at this stage, it should start to become pretty clear which class of the city these children should belong to, and so they'll be passed off as apprentices in certain classes of the city. But so far as the family structure of the city goes, basically these children will be the children of everyone that's older than them in the city. That way no one in the city will know who their biological parents are, and that way they won't honor any one member of the city above any other, right? They'll treat everyone in the city as if they are in some way related to them, right? So there's this kind of interesting intermingling of the atomic family structure that we're so familiar with in the United States, and this kind of unity of the city, right? There's a sense in which everyone in the city is at the same time part of your family. The closest kind of thing I can think of today that resembles this way of thinking about the family in the Republic is what in the Jewish culture is called a kibbutz, right? So basically this will be where a lot of Jews live together in pretty close quarters, and all the children will sort of be taken care of in common by everyone else in the kibbutz. It's something kind of like that. That seems to be what Plato envisions here. Let's see. So, as I was saying, the city will produce children only in accordance with the orders of the rulers, and the rulers will take as their chief task the maintenance of an appropriate balance among the classes, right? To make sure that there are not too many or too few people in each class, so that we can ensure that the members of each class are suited for their position and that the appropriate amount of goods are produced from each class to maintain the city and provide for the needs of the citizens in the city. So there's quite a bit of work that will have to be done by the rulers to make sure that the classes are appropriately filled and not overfilled, etc. Okay, so included in all this are some pretty strict guidelines concerning what what conditions one must meet in order to be included in a class. And you might wonder, well, who will decide that? Who will decide whether, say, Johnny, for instance, is to be a ruler or a farmer? How are they going to decide that? Well, it's not going to be any one person. It seems like this kind of decision will be sort of relegated amongst various classes, and that really what this will be take place in is the education system in the city as a whole, right? So we'll talk more about the education system for the city as a whole whenever we get to Republic Book 5. But the basic idea seems to be something like this, right? Whenever you're given a new batch of children, what you're going to do is you're going to observe them from early on. You're going to figure out, oh, look, this kid seems to be really good at climbing trees and building things, and taking care of plants, but he's not so good whenever it comes to like higher level mathematics or memorizing music and poetry. Maybe he's not a very graceful kind of person, right? This other person, however, he is really good whenever it comes to memorizing poetry and doing mathematics. But whenever it comes to anything physical, he's a real klutz, right? So we can't rely on him to really build things with his hands or engage in many physical activities. He's just not like that, right? He's more of a kind of pure intellectual kind of guy. And then you're going to have some kids who are going to be gifted in both domains, right? They're going to be really good whenever it comes to physical exercise, when it comes to engaging in things with their hands, building things, and so on. And they're also going to be really good at memorizing music and poetry, at figuring out abstract concepts like in mathematics and geometry, and so on. Okay, so roughly these division amongst three kinds of people will kind of give us an indication as to where we should put them for further training, right? Like the kid that's really good at physical things but is not so good at intellectual things, he's destined for the working classes. He's destined for those portions of the working classes where you're going to have to develop skills with your hands, right? Like building or farming or something like that, right? The kid who's really good at intellectual things but is not good at physical things, he too is destined for the working classes. You might be surprised by that, right? But that's only because you are inured to the way that Washington is structured, where, as some people have said, Washington is basically like Hollywood for ugly people, right? It's people who really can't do anything useful with their bodies, but they're really smart and they're really entertaining, right? Well, that's not what Plato thinks is good ruler material. Rather, these people who are good with their minds, but not so good with their bodies, they're going to be working class people. And they're going to be the kind of people who may be our teachers. They may be the people who are the people who are going to go sell things in the markets in foreign countries and stuff like that, right? So they're working class material as well. I'm reminded of this claim, this quote from the Jack Black character in School of Rock, right, where he said that those who can't do teach, and those who can't teach Jim, right? Something like that. That seems to be the kind of mindset Plato has for these kinds of people. And then finally, we're left with this third class, this really remarkable set of people who are both really good with things intellectual and really good with things physical. These are our guardian class people, right? These are the remarkable people who have keen senses, who can be physically fit and very active and also very strong, but also have the composure to be philosophical, such that they can understand complex situations very quickly and make good decisions at the blink of an eye. Right? That's the kind of people that we want as our ruling class, at least according to Plato. Okay. So with that in the background, let's now turn to the consideration of the virtues of the city. So with this, I'm going to go a little bit faster because the text of Republic Book 4, I think, does a pretty great job of articulating the different virtues that are present in the city, as well as in the soul. Except what's challenging about this text is trying to discern the structure of the text, like trying to figure out, okay, when is he actually talking about the virtues? Is he talking about it now? I can't really tell. So what I've done is in my notes here, I've done quite a bit of work outlining when he starts talking about the virtues of the city, right? When he's talking about the method that he's going to use to analyze the virtues of the city. And then when he's talking about each individual virtue as it's present in the city, right? So with this guide, you should be able to go to the text itself and really discern for yourself, you should be able to do this now, what he's saying about each virtue. But I'm not going to leave it just at that. I'm going to say a little bit about each of the virtues in turn in this lecture. But for now, let's take a look at the method that he's going to use to analyze the virtues in the city. The method makes some presuppositions, right? The first is that there are going to be at least 4 virtues in the city that are basic, that are sort of like virtues that anything that is a good city must have. And here, Plato seems to be drawing on like some strong intuitive notions of what political justice is. So he says that any good city is going to have at least these 4 virtues, right? It's going to have wisdom, it's going to have courage, it's going to have moderation, and it's going to have justice. Now, it's important to keep in mind that if you call a city wise, you are not thereby calling every individual member of the city wise. Similarly, if you're calling a city courageous, you're not saying that every citizen in the city is courageous. In fact, by the way Plato's going here, there's a stark divide between a city's having a virtue and an individual person's having a virtue, right? For the city to have a virtue, think about it, is for the city to be arranged in a certain way. And the city can be arranged in a certain way without individual souls in that city being arranged in that same way. So that means it's possible for a city to be wise without each and every citizen in the city to be wise. Okay, so that's something important to keep in mind right up front. The second thing to keep in mind is that Socrates is going to use a specific method for discerning what each of the 4 virtues in the city is, right? He's going to assume that we have a robust enough understanding right up front of these political virtues in order to recognize them when we see them, right? So I assume that all of you in here know what water is. You know it well enough to know it when you see it, even though you might not know exactly what water is, right? Water is H2O. Maybe you didn't know that before. Maybe you just learned that for the first time here. I really doubt that's true. You I bet already knew that. But you get the point, right? Someone can recognize water without exactly knowing what it is. We can recognize, say, a certain kind of animal without knowing exactly what kind of animal that is, without knowing, say, what the essence of that kind of animal is. So you get the point, right? So the idea is that we have a robust enough understanding. It might be confused, but it's robust enough that we can recognize something of that kind whenever we see it. And the way that the search for the virtues proceeds is by a process of elimination. Socrates says we're going to start our search by looking for those virtues in the city that we are most familiar with, that we think we have the best understanding of. And we'll move from those, after we identify them in the city, to those that are less familiar, right? Working by a process of elimination, working up to the point where we say, oh, well, whatever this virtue is that's left, that must be the one that I didn't know how to identify before, okay? Let's see. So, I have these other 2 steps characterized here. They're somewhat abstract in the characterization. So probably the best way to characterize this in an alternative fashion would just be to say this. What he's going to do is he's going to look at the city that he has imagined. He's going to look at the structures in it that enable it to perform their function well. He's then going to consider these 4 virtues that we have some intuitive understanding of. He's going to start with the one that he thinks he knows best. In this case, it's wisdom. And then he's going to look in the city and he's going to say, okay, what in this city, what structure that's operative in helping it to perform its function well most closely resembles wisdom? Oh, it's that one. So that one must be wisdom, right? Okay, so let's take a more concrete look at this. Well, if you look at this table that I've given you, you see that I pretty much outline this kind of process right here. So let's draw it up like this, right? The table has two parts. If you take a look at it, you'll see it has two parts. The part here that's highlighted in blue, this is the part of the table that represents the virtues of the city. This part in orange represents the virtues of the soul. Okay, so let's zero in on the virtues of the city side of things. You'll see that I've arranged the table where we have the parts of the city that are represented in the rows and the various the function of these parts, the virtue that's associated with these parts, the common notion of the virtue, which he thinks is like the intuitive idea that we bring to the table when we're looking for the virtues, and then ultimately the analysis of the virtues, that is the structure in the city that corresponds with this intuitive understanding. And it's this right here that stands out as the analysis of the virtue. In other words, it's the statement of the essence of the virtue as it is in the city, or strictly speaking, what the virtue of the city is. Okay, so let's work through the analysis of wisdom. Note, the analysis of wisdom takes place here at 428a through 429a. You might do well to take a moment and reread these passages in the text before you continue the video lecture. So you might pause right now and reread that. So the analysis of wisdom goes like this. He thinks that if you consider the three general classes in the city, the rulers, auxiliaries, and working classes, the class that seems to be most operative in helping a city to make wise decisions are the rulers. And this is clear because the rulers are the ones with the greatest amount of political or legislative power. So if they're the ones with legislative power that really decide what the city does, then if the city is wise, that means that the wisdom will be due largely to the workings of the rulers. So that's why we say that the rulers are the ones that are primarily associated with wisdom, right? So that's why this is highlighted in bold. Now, the common notion of wisdom is something that we've talked about before, right? You can think back to the Apology, right? Where wisdom seems to be a kind of know-how, knowing how to do something, that's paired with an account of this know-how, some sort of explanation as to why this way of doing things is the best way of doing things. And the way that Socrates thinks of this is very intuitive at this point, right? He's thinking of it as basically like it's a kind of way of knowing how to organize one's life and one's working such that you perform these things in your life well. And so the way that he understands wisdom in the city is basically this. He basically looks at what the city does that produces wise decisions, and what he sees is this, that wisdom is basically when the rulers in the city make laws that govern the actions of the other classes, right? Now the rulers make good laws by definition, at least that's the way the legislation has set them up, right, such that they can do that. So it's when the rulers make good laws for the other classes of the city, that is wisdom, okay? So wisdom really is just the wise actions of the rulers in legislating for the city. That's what the wisdom of the city is. That's the structure in the city that enables it as a city to be wise. Now consider courage. Courage comes up at 429a through 430c. You might pause the video to take a look at that. So, courage, he says, is most closely associated with the auxiliaries, right? So whatever courage is, he's arguing in this part of the text, it has something to do with what the auxiliaries do. Remember, the auxiliaries, their function is to enforce the laws of the city, and courage is the associated virtue with this. Now, he starts this analysis by thinking about what the intuitive notion of courage is, right? This is this is a virtue that's because it's farther down the path than wisdom was, right? It's something that we might have a little bit harder time really understanding what it is. But his basic understanding of courage is something that comes out of the analysis that he conducted in Republic Book 3 about how he's going to train the Guardians. What he wanted to do is to train the Guardians to be courageous, right? And what he says courage is basically it's the ability to face up to death without fear, right? It's the ability to face the possibility of death in the battlefield and not be afraid of it. That's the basic idea. So at least that's the basic intuitive idea that he's putting forward. Now I should note that Socrates does sort of and ha about this a little bit. He's not entirely sure that this is correct. And I think that he believes this because of something that his student Aristotle brought up in another book that's called the Nicomachean Ethics. I'll just say something about this briefly, but if you've ever read this story, if you've ever read Frog and Toad, that children's book story, there's one Frog and Toad story where Frog and Toad are trying to be brave, and so they go out into the world and they try to face up to their greatest fears, like going to face a snake, and then going to face a hawk, things like that, things that would normally eat frogs and toads. And the entire time they're terribly afraid, but they're nevertheless recognizing themselves as brave, right? Now what this indicates is that the truly brave person, and this is, by the way, is what Aristotle observed, the truly brave person is one who is afraid. It's just that they can somehow handle this fear in such a way that they can face up to what they're afraid of. So Plato, notice here, isn't saying that the brave person is afraid. He's saying that rather they don't fear death at all, right? So there's something of a disagreement here, and there's something to be said on both sides of the divide. But Socrates is here saying, well, it looks like probably what we're going to say courage is with relation to the Guardians is that they're not afraid of death, right? This is part of the education that we have given them. By the way, this also might be helpful, noting that the Guardians are not afraid of death. This could be helpful in understanding what Plato means whenever he's drawing the analogy between the Guardians and the pedigree young dog, where the pedigree young dog is one who can face abuse from those that he knows without attacking them. It seems like that something similar is going on here with the Guardians, right, where he can face abuse and perhaps even death from those that he knows without being afraid and without retaliating, right? Anyway, something to think about in relation to the paper you're writing. But how is courage manifest in the city, right? What's the analysis of courage in the city? Well, it's basically this. It's basically when the auxiliaries follow the commands and enforce the laws that are set by the rulers. That's what makes the city courageous. So it's not anything really mystical or magical about the city. It's just something that the auxiliaries do in relation to the rulers, enforcing the laws, obeying their commands. Okay, so now let's go to these other two, moderation and justice. Now notice, moderation and justice are also printed here as associated virtues for the other two classes. This is because Plato believes that moderation and justice are virtues that belong to all the classes in common. They aren't associated with just one class in the city, like courage and wisdom are. He talks about this primarily in relation to the working classes, right? Since the working classes are more like common folk, who aren't quite as remarkable, let's say, as the rulers of the auxiliaries, the implication is that whatever the working classes have, the auxiliaries and rulers could also have, because they're sort of like superior human beings. And so whatever virtues the working classes have, then the auxiliaries and the rulers will also have it, because the working classes are sort of like basic human beings, right? Basic forms of humanity. It's not meant to denigrate them, but it's supposed to sort of recognize what they are in the grand order of things, right? But in any case, let's set that point aside for now. So moderation, he analyzes the common sense notion of moderation. He doesn't quite come out and say exactly this, but this is the basic gist, right? Oh, I should point out the passages where he talks about this, right? Moderation comes up at 430e through 432a. I'll go ahead and read that. But if you take a look at those passages and you consider what he's saying there about what moderation is in an individual person, it seems like moderation is something like a habitual ability to enjoy the pleasures of the body, like food, related to sex, related to drink, with self-control in each case, right? He never suggests that moderation is a complete abstaining from these pleasurable things. Rather, moderation is an ability to enjoy these pleasurable things with self-control, where you don't partake too much and you don't partake too little, right? So just to run through a quick example to illustrate this, right? Suppose that we have two physically identical people go to a restaurant. And they both eat the same main course. And let's suppose that this main course has all of the nutrition that their body requires, such that if they were to eat more than what was served them in their main course, they would be overeating. They would be partaking of the food, in the pleasure of food too much. So let's suppose that both of them are offered a dessert, and both of them decline, right? So both of them act moderately. But suppose that one of them, in declining the offer of dessert, has to struggle with the desire not to give in to it, not to give in to the temptation for the dessert. But the other one doesn't have to struggle at all, right? They see the dessert as not really appetizing at this point because it would be beyond what they really need. And taking beyond what they really need is not really pleasant to them, right? They have, as it were, complete self-control with regard to their desires. Whereas this other person, who is struggling with the desire for more dessert, even though he acts moderately in declining the dessert, he's not yet fully moderate because he doesn't yet have complete self-control with regard to his desires, right? So that's the intuitive notion of moderation that the Greeks are operating with at this time, right? It's not like there are any desires that are absolutely awful in and of themselves, or at least, I mean, there are a few, right? Like the Greeks would think that you can't moderately cheat on your wife, for instance, right? You can't moderately murder someone, or you can't moderately, I don't know, engage in incest or something like that, right? Those things are just completely forbidden, right? But there are a whole other range of activities that in our puritanical culture in the United States we tend to think of as strictly forbidden just in and of themselves, like sexual pleasure, maybe even for some parts of culture, drinking at all. For the Greeks, these would not be seen as in them of themselves bad or forbidden. They would just be the kinds of things that we need to partake in with a certain level of moderation, right? Where we don't partake too much and we don't partake too little. So what's moderation in the city? It might be hard to see at first, right? Because you might think, well, we would have to think of the city as something that has desires, and that seems weird to attribute to a group of people, right? At least it's kind of difficult to understand how that would work. I'm not saying that it's impossible to understand, but it's at least kind of mystifying at first glance. But what Plato latches onto in understanding moderation in the city is basically this, that moderation in the individual soul, if we're understanding it as a kind of self-control, seems to be an agreement amongst the parts of the soul as to which part of the soul will be in charge, right? There's going to be one part of the soul that's sort of like the seat of the desires for food, sex, and drink. And there's going to be another part of the soul that's sort of like the overseer of these desires. And the moderate soul will be one in which the overseer of the desires, whatever that is the thing that is in charge of the seat of the desires themselves. So that whenever the overseer says, stop producing the desire for food, then the desire for food will cease, right? So there's a kind of agreement between the two parts as to which part will be in charge. And that's really the core of moderation in the soul. We'll see that again when we turn to moderation in the soul proper here in a moment. But he thinks that's what's happening in a moderate city. A moderate city is one in which every member of the city, every citizen, agrees about who should be in charge. And in the case of the utopia, it's when every member of the city agrees that the ruling class should be in charge. When that occurs, then the city is moderate. It's an interesting question, one we might consider in discussion, whether a democracy can be moderate. Interesting question. So finally, we get to justice. And what Socrates notices here is quite surprising. So go ahead and pause and read the passage for yourself, 432d through 433e. So you might be surprised, right, to see that justice has, as Socrates says, been rolling around at our heels the entire time. In fact, justice was the very first virtue that we discovered in the city, namely the one person, one job rule. Justice in the city is when every class in the city does its own job and doesn't attempt to do the job of another. That's the leftover virtue. After we've pointed out wisdom, courage, and moderation, the only structure that's left over that's enabling the good functioning of the city is this one person, one job rule. Okay. Now you might find that rather surprising, that that's what justice is. It might not sound quite sexy enough, really, to qualify as justice. You might think, oh, well, justice has got to be more exciting than that, right? At least I remember when I was an undergraduate and I first discerned that this is what he was saying justice was in the text, I was a little bit disappointed. However, more recently, I've been able to see that there's actually more to it than that. And this really comes out more clearly whenever we're thinking about justice in the soul, right? But if you think about like what we were talking about earlier with Plato's sort of like three-step program to the good life, where you discern what your function is, you develop the virtues to do this, and then you perform your function by means of your virtues, right? If you do that, right, in the context of a good city, there's something that seems really admirable about that, something very good, right? And I think that a lot of moral and political philosophers, right, and you can see this especially in the letter from Birmingham City Jail by Martin Luther King Jr., which I talked about briefly in other lectures, you can see how he has something like this notion of justice in society operative, right? Like there's one part where Martin Luther King Jr. says that injustice is basically the degradation of human character. And justice is basically the uplifting of human character. And what I think he means by that is a society is just whenever it enables every human being in the society to perform that function that is in line with their nature, that lifts up their God-given talents and things like that, right? Martin Luther King Jr. is a theist, so that's why I was mentioning God-given talents in relation to him, right? But Plato has something very similar in mind, right? Whenever he's thinking about this in relation to the city. Okay. So we've been going on for quite a while now. I'm going to go a little bit faster with regard to the division of the soul into three parts. And after we get that on the table, the discussion about the virtues of the soul should fall out quite quickly. Because what we have to do in order to see the virtues in the soul, now that we've discerned what the virtues in the city are, is we have to see how the soul is, if at all, analogous in its workings to the workings of the city. If we can see that the way that the perfectly good city functions is analogous to the way that the good soul functions, then the virtues as they are present in the city, that is, the ways of arranging the parts of the city that enables it to perform its function well, will thereby be the same thereby be the same virtues that are present in the soul. Okay? So all we have to do is sort of like translate from the parts of the city and the way they work together over to the parts of the soul and the way they work together, and we'll have a picture of the virtues as they are in the soul. So in order to do this, though, we have to discern the different parts of the soul. This might seem surprising to you that Plato thinks he has to do this, but this is because we live in a time whenever our understanding of the nature of the mind has grown immensely. And Plato, really, at this point in the history of ancient Greece, is doing something radically new by thinking about the nature of the soul, by thinking about the nature of the interior part of the human being, right? Where by interior, I mean something like the spiritual part of the human being, right? The psychological part of the human being, if we want to put it in more secular terms. This is new, really, with Plato, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the discussion section, if you like how this is new, why I think this is new, at least new with Plato. So, what he does to divide the soul into parts is he starts off with a statement of a principle. Okay, and this principle I like to call the principle of division. So you would do well at this point to pause and read these passages where he introduces the so-called principle of division. It's 436a through 438e. That's some good espresso. I need it to get through all this, right? Okay, so the principle states, and here's a quote from the text, "It is obvious that the same thing will not be willing to do or undergo opposites in the same part of itself in relation to the same thing at the same time. So, if we ever find this happening in the soul, we'll know that we aren't dealing with one thing, but many." You might do well now to rewind me and listen to that again and maybe reread it again and think through it a little bit. But for now, I'm going to jump straight to some illustrations of it to try to help you get a sense of it, right? He's giving us here a principle that will enable us to discern different parts of a thing, okay? And he says that if we encounter in the thing two opposites, that is, two things that exclude each other, present in this one thing at the same time, or present in this one thing in relation to something else at the same time, then we'll have to understand this thing as having two distinct parts, each of which bear one of the two opposites. So for example, if I say to you, "My precious coffee cup is both fresh out of the freezer cold and fresh out of the microwave hot," you might at first say, "But Professor Kidd, that is impossible, because something cannot be both fresh out of the freezer cold and fresh out of the microwave hot." So what I would do in response to this in order to make my claim true is I would say, oh, but consider the principle of division, which says that if we ever find two opposites present in one thing at the same time, then we will understand it as having two different parts, one of which is fresh out of the freezer cold, say the handle, and the other of which is fresh out of the microwave hot, say the body of the cup, right? Notice, in order for it to be both hot and cold, it will have to have two different parts, one of which bears the coldness, the other of which bears the hotness. What about this business about relations to things, right? He does say, will not be willing to do or undergo opposites in the same part of itself in relation to the same thing at the same time. Why does he bring up relations? Well, consider a property like shortness or tallness. This is not a property that things have all on their own. Rather, you're only short in relation to something else that's taller than you. And you're only tall in relation to other things that are shorter than you. So, there is a way in which I can be both short and tall at the same time. How would you do that? Well, you would place alongside me here someone like Peter Dinklage, right? The guy that plays Tyrion Lannister from Game of Thrones, you know, the little guy, right? The dwarf in the story. And then over here, you would place someone like LeBron James, right? The giant LeBron James, right? So we'd have Tyrion, Tyrion Lannister and LeBron James. In relation to Tyrion, I would be tall. In relation to LeBron, I would be short. See? And the way to do that is you would have to divide me up into parts where like I'm related. There's like a part of me that is a relation to Tyrion Lannister, and there's another part of me that's a relation to LeBron James, right? So that's the way to think about it there. So the way that he divides the soul into parts is he considers examples of situations where we recognize our internal state, our mind, as sort of drawn in two directions or undergoing opposite desires or tendencies at one and the same time. And he says in order for the soul to do this, it has to be divided up into parts according to the principle of division. Okay, so if you would, go ahead and read these passages, starting at 439a through d, where he gives the illustration of discerning the rational and appetitive parts, 439e through 440e, discerning the appetitive and spirited parts, and then 440e through 441c, discerning the rational and spirited parts. Okay, go ahead and pause and read those three and see how they're giving different illustrations for different things. Now, let me go ahead and give my own examples, okay? So what he's talking about to illustrate the division of rational and appetitive parts is basically the kind of experience that you undergo whenever you, say, are on a diet, okay? Let's say you're on a diet, and you come home and you realize that your dear roommate or your mother, in my case, I mean, gosh, when I go to my mom's house, she's always like, hey, Chad, I just bought like 3 pizzas and some Bluebell ice cream. Would you like some? Right? I can't go on a diet when I'm around my mom. She babies me too much. It's awful. But let's suppose I'm on a diet, right? And she lays before me a big bowl of cookies and cream ice cream from Bluebell, right? Which is by far the best ice cream on earth, in my humble opinion. In that case, right, if I'm hungry, one part of me will be thinking, Chad, you should not eat that ice cream. You are on a diet. The other part of me will be thinking, hey, ice cream, eat it, at one and the same time. Has anyone ever had experience like that? If you haven't, I'm not sure you're human. But in any case, that's the kind of thing he has in mind, right? Now, how do we explain that? Well, there's got to be one part of my soul that is the part that's drawing me to eat the ice cream. And this is the appetitive part of the soul. This is the part that's the seat of my desires for material things. The other part is the rational part of the soul, the part that deliberates and thinks about what is the best thing to do, right? So you can see the outline of the 3 parts of the soul that he's going to illustrate the division of right here, right? So that's to illustrate the first divide. Now we need to illustrate the divide between the appetitive and spirited parts. What he does here is he considers cases where, say, you're trying to fight against a desire for a material thing, not by thinking about it, but rather by simply getting angry at yourself, sort of like just through pure grit, pulling yourself away from doing it, right? Like, if any of you were ever at one point, say, addicted to cigarettes or going through the process now of quitting smoking cold turkey, right, without any sort of chemical help, right, like a patch or gum or something, you'll kind of know what I'm talking about, right? Because like the more you think about smoking or something like that, the more likely you are to go smoke. So what do you do instead? Well, instead you just sort of like wrench your mind away from thinking about that desire. Right? And you can do this in various ways by forcing yourself to, say, go running or forcing yourself to go on a long walk or something like that, right? So that's the kind of thing he has in mind. It's not where you're thinking through and coming up with reasons not to smoke. It's where you're just saying no, right? Just getting angry at yourself and stopping yourself from doing it. The example he gives for showing the distinction between the rational and the spirited parts are basically like this. He says, okay, it seems like there are beings who are really spirited, but not very rational. And the kinds of beings that he has in mind here are children, right? Like babies and toddlers. I don't know how many of you have dealt with babies and toddlers, but this is quite accurate, right? Like my youngest son, who is 3, he can become totally irate. He can become just enraged. And it's not entirely clear why. And it's pretty clear that he has no idea why he's enraged either, right? There's like no clear reason for his anger. right? But he is nevertheless really angry. So clearly, he has a pretty robust capacity of spirit, of anger making in his soul, without a very robust capacity for reason. So clearly, these two capacities must be distinct, right? There's also those cases where, say, whenever you're sort of overcome with anger, where you can see the conflict between your anger and your reason, right? Like, say you have, I don't know, like, consider the last time that you were, I don't know, playing a sport and your friend, say, accidentally hurt you in some way. Maybe they accidentally elbowed you in the nose or accidentally tripped you and you like really hurt something there. I mean, I don't know about you, but for many people, the first reaction that they have in relation to this, they might not follow through on it, is to hurt them back, right? But what stops you from hurting them back is thinking in your mind, oh, that was just an accident. You shouldn't hit them back. That was purely an accident, right? So there's a case where spirit is pulling you to lash out, but your reason is what is holding you back, right? So they can come into conflict as well. So he has these kinds of cases in mind. So running through these illustrations, in light of the principle of division, it looks like there are cases where our minds or our souls undergo opposites, being pulled in two directions at one and the same time. And this can only be explained by the soul being divided up into these three different parts. Now again, the appetitive parts, this is like the working classes. The appetitive parts of the soul is actually a class of different parts. And he thinks that you can have many different kinds of appetites, and that sometimes these appetites can come into conflict with one another, right? Like, I don't know, suppose that you are given a choice between drinking a cold glass of water on a really hot day and, I don't know, being given $100, right? These are both material goods that you would be lusting after, and there would be a genuine conflict here as to which one you're going to take. I would take the money, no doubt, but, there would still be a little bit of a conflict if I were really thirsty. So, okay. So, given the analogous structure of the three parts of the utopia and the three parts of the soul, the argument that he outlines in these passages, and notice the arguments are pretty quick, right? He outlines these arguments in the space of about 4 Stephanus pages, so it's really quick. I mean, even less. It's more like 3. He just says, okay, look, like if you look at the way we think about wisdom in the soul, and you think about like the intuitive notion of wisdom, and you think about how this would actually be fleshed out in the workings of the three parts of the soul that we've isolated, you see that the way that wisdom plays itself out in the city is pretty much the same way that it plays itself out in the soul, right? Except with relation to the three parts of the soul. So in the city, remember, the city is wise when the rulers make good decisions that the other parts of the city follow. So also, wisdom in the soul will be whenever the rational part of the soul makes good decisions that the other parts of the soul follow. Okay? Courage in the city will be whenever the spirited part of the soul supports the decisions made by reason, right? So suppose that you are running into battle and your rational part of your soul is telling you you should follow the commands of your leader because that is the right thing to do. But the appetitive part of your soul is saying something like, be scared, because this might really hurt whenever you get, I don't know, hit by an arrow or cut by a sword or something, right? But you nevertheless decide to proceed into battle, right? This is because the spirited part of the soul is pressing you forward, right, against that fear. So that's the kind of idea that he has in mind. Moderation, again, it's whenever, remember it, the way I characterized it earlier, it's whenever you can control your soul with regard to the pleasures of the body, right? It's whenever you can enjoy the pleasures of the body with complete self-control, where you are not inclined to overtake or undertake in these pleasures, which means that the appetitive part of the soul is in complete agreement that the rational part should rule. Whenever reason says, stop desiring to drink alcohol, then the appetites stop, right? Like one drink at the party, you know that you shouldn't drink anymore because you've got to drive home, then you don't do it anymore, because not because you're struggling with it anymore. It's just because your appetites are so subservient to reason that now you find getting another drink not pleasurable at all, right? So it's that kind of idea. And then ultimately, justice is just sort of like the harmony of all three parts of the soul, all three parts of the soul working together, right? Where whenever the rational part of the soul is giving commands, then the appetitive part of the soul is not trying to do the job of the rational part of the soul. It's not trying to overtake the job of giving commands. Or whenever the appetitive part of the soul is trying to, determine you to do the right thing in accordance with reason, then the appetites are not trying to overtake the role of the spirited part of the soul, right? So like that's the kind of view that he has in mind, right? And that also will help you to understand part of the characterization that he gives at 443D through 444A. Go ahead and pause and read that really quick. We're almost done. Go ahead and read that. I mean, as you can see there, what he's really emphasizing there is this idea of justice being a kind of robust harmony in the soul, right? Now, for the ancient reader, what stands out to them is this, that justice is not something that is necessarily external to the soul. Rather, justice is something that's internal to the soul. It's a kind of harmony of the internal workings of the human person in acting in the world, right? So it's internal to the person, as we might say, right? Which is helping us to see better how justice is a good that is intrinsic to the soul of the body, right? It's intrinsic insofar as it obtains amongst the parts of the soul of the person. Also, the ancient mind would see here a correlation with happiness, right? They would see that what's being put forward here is not happiness in the sense of a fleeting feeling, right? Like, I'm happy right now because the sun is out, but then, oh God, I think about the economy and now I'm not so happy. That's not the kind of happiness that he has in mind here related to justice. Rather, happiness is understood as a kind of constant well-being. It's a very stable state of well-being. This doesn't mean that the just person can't be at some points in his life maybe a little bit anxious or maybe a little bit afraid or maybe even angry, right? But it does mean that this anger or this fear or this anxiety will always be tempered by a basis of harmony amongst the parts of the soul in his or her actions in the world. Also, this passage brings to light something we'll talk about more in discussion, which is the idea that these four virtues of the soul, wisdom, moderation, courage, and justice, that these four virtues are unified in a really interesting way. They're unified in such a way that you can't have one of these virtues without also having the rest of them, right? So just think about it. Suppose that we have a soul that lacks moderation, such that some parts of the soul don't agree that the rational part of the soul should be in charge. Let's say that we have an appetite or two that tries to make decisions on the part of the rational part of the soul, right? So that, say, your desire for food or your desire for sex overrides what you know to be the right thing to do in a particular situation. In this situation, right, it seems like this soul could not be just, because the harmony that's supposed to exist amongst the parts of the soul would be lost in losing moderation, right? So it looks like losing moderation also means losing justice. And then once you lose justice, where suddenly not all the parts of the soul are sticking to their own job and not meddling in the business of another, then it looks as if this will undermine the wisdom of the soul, because then suddenly some parts of the soul might be trying to overcome the job of the rational part of the soul. And this in turn will jeopardize the courage of the soul, right? Because then it means that if, say, the auxiliary, if say spirit no longer agrees that the rational part of the soul should be in charge, then spirit will no longer be obeying the dictates of reason, right? Anyway, we'll talk more about this, about the unity of the virtues in the discussion section today, because that's a pretty good place to start for thinking back through the structure of this. Okay, I hope that that was helpful. I know that the way that I presented it today was pretty different from the way that I've done it in the past, but we'll see how it goes, okay? So thanks for your time, and I will gladly see you later.